why are we talking about China? So as we were saying earlier, if you can refresh your brains back to like 10 minutes ago, massive amount of negative sentiment coming out of China. And the reason it matters is that we've actually seen this before. So Chinese players have actually review bombed games in the past. Some kind of famous examples are Overwatch and Helldivers 2. And it's this interesting thing because we'll get into the specifics of why this could happen, or air quotes, what's wrong with the Chinese player base. But Western markets are slowing, generally speaking. People are making less and less money from Western markets because they're so overly saturated with product. People are looking to markets like China then to grow the amount of money that they're making on their games, because largely a lot of Western developers are having difficulty getting into China because the government is so protective of the products that get brought into the country. And also China just has so many fucking people that it's a massive market for anyone. So they're all salivating to like get in there.
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, you can't really discount just how populous China is, and you also can't discount the degree to which a great many of those people just want to play games. So the Chinese market is enormous, and is becoming increasingly vital to the large scale success of any game. Where it might not be, relevant to every single game depending on the scale they're in, but if you want to have success at the scale that Slay the Spire 2 is having success, or the scale that Helldivers 2 had success, or the scale that Overwatch 2 had players possibly, if not so much success, you do need that Chinese market. You absolutely need that Chinese market. But the danger there goes, there's many different angles for that to take, but there are cultural differences, both in terms of what people expect from a game and how they both can and will communicate what they expect from a game. And as an audience becomes more global, so too must our understanding of how those audiences relate to what they're playing. So as we kind of move into that section of the conversation, I think, Zach, you and I, neither of us have any interest in making like broad, sweeping generalizations about like the entire Chinese player base or the entire Chinese Steam user base. The same way that we wouldn't necessarily describe English-speaking users as a singular monolith, all, organized and singular in their vision and their opinions. We absolutely won't be doing that with the Chinese market either, just because it's reductive and kind of counterintuitive and not at all beneficial to what we're talking about. So we're kind of talking about the macro trend, not so much the micro detail. When we use terms like they, it's more out of necessity than an intentional othering as well. Just to sort of lay that groundwork. Sorry if that was, too woke for that other podcast, just in case they decide to listen.
Yeah, I'm sure the other podcast loves China. So yeah, I think ultimately I actually land on the page that Chinese players are not all that different from the rest of the world. We can dig into some of the details here, but specifically when looking at the reviews that are being placed on Steam, a lot of the criticism and comments that the Chinese players are posting apparently is pretty similar to the kind of reviews and feedback that Megacrit, the developers of Slay the Spire, are getting from other language groups. So I think that suggests that generally speaking, it's not like Chinese players are like particularly picky or demanding than any other region. To me, that suggests that, for whatever reason, it's the Steam reviews where they're deciding to levy this criticism and feedback. And I think that the most interesting thing that kind of came out of learning about this subject for me personally was like, why is that happening? And so Aaron and I, we watched a Michael Bell video, or Bellular video. We reference this man so frequently. And
he does a pretty good job. He takes complicated things, he makes them digestible. It works.
No, I truly think he does do a good job. And sometimes, he's maybe a little bit more impassioned about things that I don't think are all that important. But like generally speaking, I think Michael Bell does a fantastic job. You should check him out. Love the content. But Michael mentions that Discord, Twitter, and Steam community features are all banned in China. So when Chinese players are using a VPN to access international Steam, they don't have access to, for example, my understanding is they don't have access to like the beta branch. They can't go into the community features and like leave comments like a lot of Western players can. They can't go to Twitter to post at, Megacrit. They can't join a Discord channel to leave feedback. And so one of the ways that they feel like they can get noticed is by leaving Steam reviews. And if you kind of think about, even in the United States, like what are the majority of the reviews that you'll see for stuff? I feel like the majority of reviews probably skew negative. Like if I like something, I probably won't make a review. But if I really don't like something, I probably will make a review. And so I think that's probably a really big indicator as to why there is this overwhelmingly negative sentiment coming from simplified and traditional Chinese language users on Steam, is probably some amount of this mentality. It feels like this is the only way that they can really communicate with the developers directly. And generally speaking, I think reviews skew negative for most cultures than positive, just being honest. And ultimately I thought that was really interesting. And I will say, to Megacrit's credit, they've been very understanding, and I don't think they've been particularly critical of the Chinese player base, basically saying it's unfortunate that they feel that's the only way that they can leave feedback, but we completely understand they don't really have the tools necessary to work within the confines of the way we would prefer them to.
Right, yeah. I mean, it's kind of the idea of like, if you don't have a cell phone, you have to use the flare gun. You know what I mean? On the deserted island, right? There's only so many ways when a government is as restrictive of platforms and free speech and whatnot as China's government tends to be. There literally just are only so many ways that a player base can vocalize their pleasure or displeasure with something. And I tend to agree with you. I think that reviews, broadly speaking, I think that reviews skew towards the extremes, the majority of the time, to the point where, middling reviews often become kind of a joke. Or even a meme. Like there's a handful of YouTube channels that I watch movie reviews from, and one of them sells like 6 or 7 out of 10 t-shirts, and I think that people have made those about like IGN reviews as well, because those sort of in the middle reviews feel like less of a thing than an extreme review. And if you were to look at your average Amazon reviews or Google reviews or something like that, broadening it outside of media, you do again tend to see a higher concentration of 4 and 5 star reviews, very on the 3 and 2 stars, and then more 1 star reviews, just because people tend to gravitate towards those extremes when wanting to share an opinion. I'm more motivated to share my opinion when it is extreme as opposed to when it is flat, when it is middling, when it's like, well, that was fine. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not perfect, but it's, whatever. That's not that compelling of a reason to get out of bed and, go write a review for something. So like, I do get exactly the idea that, yeah, I mean, it's falling into a pretty predictable behavior pattern. It's just that the venue is perhaps, I mean, it's certainly not what Steam was intended for. Is another point that Michael Bell brings up in the video, is like, Steam was not designed to solve this problem. It just happens to be the mouthpiece through which this entire community of players is able to vocalize what they'd like to see the community, or not to see the community, but see the developers do and change. And I think on that level, it kind of speaks to a broader issue, but not necessarily something for Steam to, I mean, Steam might eventually need to, address this in some way, but I also think that there's not anything inherently wrong with players. Same way that the devs have said, there's nothing inherently wrong with players vocalizing their displeasure in this way. It's just not immediately beneficial to the developers, and it is I don't know, it's complicated. It is definitely a very complicated thing.
Well, I will say, I think the benefit of Slay the Spire 2 is that it has this kind of like name recognition that a lot of other games may not have. So one thing I failed to mention earlier is that Chinese reviews skewing more negative is a very typical trend if you look at any game and you look at the reviews that they're receiving. If it's got a big enough audience that it's attracting Chinese players, generally speaking, the Chinese reviews will be more negative than the other language groups. And so I think that also implies, what we're talking about, at least to some degree, that Chinese players are leveraging this space as a way to be heard by developers and therefore are a little bit more critical, especially when they are providing constructive criticism or criticism in general. So where I was going with that ultimately, though, is it's more damaging for like a small game. So like we just had a buddy that released a game called Bobo Bay. You should go check it out. It's actually doing kind of, not even kind of, I think it's doing very, very well for what's functionally like a first commercial release for our friend. And if it got massively review bombed by Chinese players, it would be much more impactful because it's an unknown element. People are going to check out Slay the Spire 2, even if it is listed as mostly negative, or they'll be curious enough to dig into why is this game mostly negative, and they'll probably kind of get some idea of, oh, Chinese players are spamming, negative reviews, blah, 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 blah. That same, amount of effort will not be afforded to a small indie game.
Right.
And I think that's where it probably matters a little bit more that there's this massive review bomb spam. But yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of an interesting thing, is that it's access to the developer, which could be, skewing the data in this way, at least partially to some degree. I think the other thing that's kind of interesting, Aaron, is that this is mostly anecdotal evidence from a user that posted on Reddit. So, I'm kind of skeptical of listening to a single person that says they're Chinese and, treating them like a monolith. But a user on Reddit did comment that Chinese players see the goal of Slay the Spire as being obtaining infinite combos, which ultimately relies on deck thinning and doing these like small decks in the game. And these were two things that were very much targeted by this first balance patch, is they being the developers really don't want you to have infinite combos that are really easy to achieve because it messes with the balance of the game. It can make certain builds feel really weak, and ultimately can make the game feel pretty trivial. So this is kind of an interesting thing where, with like Helldivers, there was what the community wanted the game to feel like, and then there was what the developers wanted the game to feel like, and those two things were not in agreement. And so it sounds like to some degree there might be some of that going on with the Chinese player base and the developers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been a fair amount of talk about like, optimizing the fun out of an experience. And I can completely understand the developers not wanting there to be such like an overpowered dominant strategy inside of their game that is meant to be challenging, that is meant to, draw multiple runs and have you really sort of struggling to progress for stages of the game and really make those things feel like an achievement. And yeah, to sort of trivialize the game out of the gate, this early into early access, it does make sense to me that would be something to be removed from the game, or at least modified to make it slightly harder to achieve those combos, or at least less likely to achieve those combos. But yeah, I mean, I can definitely see there being an optimization focused subset of the player base that absolutely wants to just run for those infinite combos and see how high they can make number go up. And how like overpowered they can get their build to be. I'm sure that is a great deal of fun for a great many people. Again, I don't necessarily have any way to verify that is a distinctly, uniquely, or, in any way more predominantly Chinese mindset than it would be anywhere else. But at the very least, these modifications do seem to have a lot of people incensed, so maybe there is some truth to the fact that, Chinese audiences broadly have a different, way of interfacing with that game's systems. Maybe there just are people who are more passionate about that variety of gameplay than there are in English-speaking audiences by volume. It's always possible. But yeah, that definitely is a very big part of the disconnect, wherever that may be originating.
Yeah, I hesitate to say that it's like uniquely Chinese, like anything that we've been talking about here. But like I said, it did come up on the Reddit post, and I did think it was kind of interesting because it echoed of previous stories that we'd covered in the past. That being said, I've seen plenty of YouTube videos that focus on infinite combos in Slay the Spire 2. So like clearly this is a thing that people are finding enjoyment with inside and outside of the Chinese player base. And knowing players, when you take stuff away from them or make content harder, you're probably going to get some level of backlash from the player base.
I've been playing, and this is weirdly analogous to the difficulty conversation. And I promise I won't go too deep into this, but I've been playing Saros a lot, actually. The new game from Housemarque, the bullet hell, the Resogun and Returnal people. Mm-hmm. And first off, it's great. It's a very, very good game. Mechanically speaking, it is rock solid. It is Moorish. It is that same like roguelike structure that you just want to keep playing the game run after run after run after run. It's not perfect. There are definitely a handful of things that are not incredible about it. But on Reddit, the game's community is very split between people who think that all of the different changes made from Returnal to this game in order to make it more broadly accessible and give players a higher likelihood of actually completing the game and rolling credits than there were in Returnal. That is extremely divisive. Like, just rolling through posts on Reddit, you'll probably find about a 50-50 split of people who find this game horrifically disappointing because it committed the terrible sin of being more not necessarily moment-to-moment easier, but certainly more accessible to players and gives people a lot more tools in order to make the experience slightly more surmountable. And for some people, that is original sin. That is absolutely damning. That is reason enough to refund the game and boycott the studio because, my God, they robbed me of the experience of playing my very favorite game, Returnal, which was famously so punishing that the majority of players did not complete the game. They bounced off of it. And that was something that the studio wanted to address. And even taking into account the fact that the game is packed to the gills with ways to essentially customize the difficulty to your specifications, be that make the game way harder or make the game way easier. Some people even find the fact that those are in the game to be distasteful, indicating some sort of lack of purity to the experience. So, my point being that the difficulty argument is going to be present even within, just the English-speaking community on Reddit inside of America. And so every single sort of patch is dissected on this level to see if they are actually making the game harder or making the game easier, changes that people like, changes that people don't like. And people do take note of those changes, and those changes tend to end up causing the majority of the sticking because... as was discussed in one of our other source videos, which was
talk about Wei Shush. Is it the
yes,
Chinese
Wei Shush
bilingual? Yeah.
Yeah, it was a Chinese bilingual YouTuber who was talking about having translated a good handful of these reviews, was talking a lot about like just players' resistance to change in general, and how a lot of these things most likely would not have resulted in lower review scores or review bombings at all if these changes had shipped with the first version of early access. But the fact that there were modifications made to the difficulty of the Doormaker boss, eventually removing it outright and replacing it with something else, or changes made to the balancing, the changes may in fact have been the issue, not the result of the changes. In terms of like incensing the community, I guess is what I'm saying. So yeah, I don't know. There's a little bit of a through line to the Seros thing where you've got differences from something people already knew, sending half of the community into a complete tizzy, and the rest of the people just being like, "No, this is pretty good. I can roll with this." There is this fascinating sort of bifurcation just on the basis of having a point of comparison, about which to get angry.
I think it's the interesting thing on the difficulty discussion, though, is that what Wei Shush ultimately is bringing up is in his video, which I do recommend checking out. It's an interesting dive, at least into the top 30 most helpful Chinese reviews and kind of understanding what they're actually saying and what, from his perspective, is valid and not. But regardless, the difficulty conversation is interesting because it always comes up with a FromSoft game, and that always comes up about how we don't want an easier version of the game to play because it somehow diminishes the hard version that we're playing. At the same time, though, I bet those people would be upset if a base version of a FromSoft game came out and then FromSoft patched it to make it harder. I think that generally speaking, players are less critical of nerfs than they are of buffs towards like content difficulty. People don't want content to get harder from the first time that they played it most of the time. It's like that famous quote about how players would optimize the fun out of a game if they could choose to. Mm-hmm. It's like people are always looking for the most like efficient path through content. And it's I don't know that we've got control over that. Perhaps that's just like a human failure in our biology.